I will introduce John Campbell, who hardly needs any introduction because everyone knows the famous John Campbell, who is no longer the chairman of the Department of Economics at Harvard. And all of the things that he still is, I think, are greatly appreciated by all of us. I will highlight only one thing, which is that I think that his 2006 address at the ASSA meetings really was a kind of a catalyzing event to help bring the field of consumer finance, household finance, in which some of us had been laboring for many years, to bring it kind of into the mainstream and make it respectable. And so we are deeply grateful to him for that and for the fact that he is here and about to give us the lunchtime talk.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Well, Chris asked me to make some, general remarks suitable for your digestion after lunch and the airplanes. So I'm not going to present a research paper. I'm going to offer some thoughts, framing thoughts, really. But I also want to say I'm, very respectful of the quality of the thinking and the people in this room. And there are lots of the things that I will mention that I am, I feel at a big disadvantage relative to others in the room. So I offer these comments with suitable modesty. Now, I thought I was going to have the distinction of putting up the first camel picture of the day, but Ling Ling beat me to it. She front ran me. So anyway, this is just to sort of fix ideas. I mean, cost-benefit analysis perhaps might be that strange-looking city in the distance there, and here we are crossing the desert trying to get to it on a camel. But, we have to be cautious because possibly, you can't tell in the picture, but possibly the whole city is a mirage, doesn't really exist at all. And then, of course, we should notice the camels at the top right that seem to be heading off in the wrong direction and going into the desert. So, what I want to talk about is this journey and whether it will end well or not. Okay, so I'm just going to, this is my outline. I want to talk about some of the special issues that arise when we think about doing cost-benefit analysis for consumer finance purposes. In other words, what the CFPB has to do, and many other agencies as well that get involved in consumer regulation. Then, I want to just muse for a few minutes about some of the issues that arise in this particular context. And I'll cover two conceptual issues. First of all, what are the market failures? What is going wrong in the first place that might justify regulation? And secondly, how should we think about transfers in this context? If we're transferring, let's say, from unsophisticated agents to sophisticated agents, how do we think about trading off the costs and the benefits to those different agents? And then I'll talk about a couple of more empirical measurement issues that arise when you really think, how are you going to do this? One is, how might you estimate the degree of consumer diversity in a market? And there are a couple of dimensions there. There's diversity in sophistication, and there's also diversity in rational choice or preference. And then finally, I'll talk about the search for natural experiments and whether we might need unnatural experiments as well, and then I'll wrap up. Okay, so what is the context here? Well, this whole field of consumer finance and the concerns about consumer financial protection are very data-driven. I think that's one of the things the CFPB means when it says it is a 21st century agency. And cost-benefit analysis is mandated in any case for really all the agencies that are making consumer financial regulations. If they're executive agencies, this is the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which is part of OMB. And for the CFPB, it's in the Dodd-Frank Act that this has to be done. Now that raises the question, do we know how to do this? Is this possible at all, or is it just a mirage? And there's quite a debate among legal scholars about this. So my sort of Harvard Law School colleagues are all over the place. John Coates is on one side quite skeptical, Cass Sunstein much more optimistic, Eric Posner at Chicago more optimistic. Another Harvard Law School colleague, Howell Jackson, has just written a very interesting paper, ongoing project with Paul Rothstein of the CFPB, where they do a sort of empirical study where they analyze a whole bunch of recent regulatory cost-benefit analyses, and they have 72 cases that they look at in some detail. And one of the main findings there is that in practice what's going on now is CBA that is super, super narrow. So the benefits in particular are defined extremely, extremely narrowly. So for example, if the regulation is something that will provide information to consumers, that'll lower search costs, the CBA would say, all right, well, we're going to save 10 minutes per consumer times the number of consumers times the value of the consumer's time. That's $1 a benefit. And of course, this ignores any kind of broader effects, such as the effect on market competitiveness, pricing, and so forth. So these narrow analyses are really just getting at the tip of the iceberg. Now, one can say that there's an obvious political reason to proceed this way. You're going to get less hassle, less opposition. Certainly, any thought of mentioning market power in the financial industry is going to trigger a great deal of challenge, politically and legally. And, if narrow benefits are enough to get you over the line in a particular case, why do more? On the other hand, I think the narrow approach is not only intellectually unsatisfying, but it also misses an opportunity to build a better framework over time. If one could get some consensus on broader approaches, then maybe each broader analysis will make the next one easier to do. Okay, so let's then discuss some of the issues that we would have to confront in order to do a kind of broader and perhaps more satisfying cost-benefit analysis. So first, I'll talk about two conceptual issues. What are the market failures, and what should we think about transfers? So in terms of market failures, I wrote a paper 4 years ago now with Howell Jackson and Bridget Madrian and Peter Tufano called Consumer Financial Protection, and that was in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. And it was just a survey paper, but one of the things we did is list the different kinds of justifications for intervention in markets and categorize them. And we had the first three categories here. We went through the obvious traditional things that you could find in any micro textbook, even from a couple of decades ago. Externalities, information problems, including the particularly important class of principal-agent problems which arise in these markets, public goods, market power. And then we added the behavioral considerations, which we grouped very, very crudely into two broad categories. Cognitive limitations, which is simply sort of failing to process information and use it, versus behavioral biases, which might obviously include present bias, but could also include loss aversion and things like that. And then we added in distributional considerations, which are again traditional. We know that free markets may give you a Pareto optimum, but you may not like the distribution of utility that results from that. And then what Jackson and Rothstein do quite rightly is to add another category, which turns out to be important in practice, which is legal and institutional arguments that essentially are saying that we may need regulations to fix the unintended consequences of existing regulations. In other words, the market has already been intervened. We have a legal system, we have an institutional framework, and so defects in that may also cause problems in the marketplace. Now, the point I just want to make, and I think many people in the room are very aware of this and know it better than I do, is that where things get really interesting for researchers but complicated for policymakers is when these different types of market failures interact with one another. And in particular, the behavioral effects interacting with traditional market failures and distributional concerns. This is really what gives you welfare losses that can be quite large. Okay, so I'll just give three examples. Conveniently, they all begin with S: search, salience, and shrouding. Just sketching it out in very general form, search models have market power to providers when they know that consumers must search. And that can lead, depending on the form of the model, to positive externalities from search activity. Because if I search, I'm going to make the demand curve more elastic, and the providers may respond to that. So there are many examples on this. Here I cite a recent paper by Darrell Duffy and co-authors on over-the-counter markets, where they're thinking about the social value of benchmarks that reveal information and lower search costs. But there's actually a poster in that corner of the room, the far corner there, by Alexei Alexandrov and Sergei Kulaev of the CFPB, which also explores a similar point in the context of mortgages. But the general point would be that a behavioral phenomenon, which is the reluctance to search, to shop around, that actually may have greater social costs than private costs, in which case regulation that lowers search costs or encourages search may have benefits, social benefits, that would exceed the direct reduction in search costs, in which case the narrow approach to CBA is going to be inadequate. Okay, so that's a first thought. Now, a second instance where behavioral forces may interact with traditional ones is if we think about the effect of salience on consumer information processing. The traditional case for disclosures is that information is a public good. It may be very inefficient for each consumer to gather it. After all, it's the same information that everybody else is using, and it's costless to disseminate once it's been gathered. So why not have a public body disclose, or why not mandate disclosure? But of course, we know, and you're all very aware of this, that consumers may fail to understand disclosures, but they also may overreact to certain types of information that are presented in a salient way. A nice example of this, I took these images from the appendix of a paper by Antoinette Shaw and her co-author Rue on credit card marketing. And this is at the back of the paper. The bottom right is the Schumer box, of course, which is the result of disclosure regulation. The thing on the top left is an example of what credit card marketers show consumers in the same package, the same mailing that they get along with the Schumer box. They have to show the Schumer box. They don't have to show the cruise ship. But consumers love looking at the cruise ship and hate looking at the Schumer box. So it's not surprising that, particularly over time, they document that over time, marketing materials are more and more dominated by cruise ship material, which becomes very salient. Okay, now in that case, I mean, one view of this is that, well, so disclosure rules can be circumvented, in effect. I mean, you have to show the Schumer box information, but you can distract consumers with a cruise ship picture so they don't look at it. So you've got you, the unscrupulous marketer, have got around the regulation. That would be one view of it. But you might push this line of thought a little further, and you might think that actually there could be circumstances where the optimal policy might actually be to limit the type of information that is provided. Andre Schleifer with Bordali and Genaioli have a recent paper on a model of salience and overreaction. And they, in that paper, give the example of sales practices of insurance on durable goods. So, you go to the car dealer, you buy the car, you're all excited, and then at the last minute they say, well, even though it's a very reliable car, it might break down. Wouldn't you like an extended warranty? Or with a TV or a household appliance. And those insurance policies famously are very overpriced. I think we all in this room know to avoid those policies. But the Bordali, Genaioli, Schleifer point is that the possibility that the new purchase will break is mentioned at a moment when that risk then becomes very salient, and you're willing to pay much too much to mitigate the risk. So, you could imagine that the right regulation might be to prevent that practice by limiting the information that's provided. Or, of course, one could say, well, along with mentioning this risk, the salesperson must mention the true probability that it will occur. So you could keep pushing on more disclosure. But my point is just that, again, this is a sort of an obvious point, that in a behavioral world, there can be interactions between the behavioral biases and the traditional arguments for disclosure. Okay, and then of course the third point, which has come up during the conference, most recently in John Zinman's presentation this morning, is the concern about shrouding, that some consumers may be unaware of costly add-ons or expensive back-end features of a good that you can avoid with some effort and sophistication. And John was talking about overdraft charges on checking accounts. Well, in that case, you can get a shrouded equilibrium in which competition will lower the front-end costs and sophisticated consumers will benefit from the existence of the unsophisticated. Well, that cross-subsidy raises important distributional issues because the market is actually producing a transfer from unsophisticated to sophisticated consumers. So one of the reasons to be concerned about this is a distributional reason. So here we have an example where behavioral factors are interacting with a more traditional distributional concern. And then, of course, one of the points of the seminal Gabex and Leibson paper is that it may be impossible for private agents to innovate in a socially beneficial manner because their marketing efforts are just going to make people sophisticated, and those sophisticated consumers are going to want to hop on the bandwagon and gain from the cross-subsidy rather than buy a better new product. And I've emphasized the potential relevance of this for mortgage refinancing in the US. David Miles has emphasized it for the UK, that mortgage rates basically in our markets as they exist today are lower because a lot of people don't know to refinance. That generates payments to mortgage lenders, which in a competitive market get passed on in the form of lower rates ex ante. So economists can dream up wonderful new products, automatically refinancing mortgages, for example, but these would be more expensive, actually, for sophisticated consumers. Okay, so I'm not, unfortunately, solving any of these problems. I'm just reminding the CFPB how hard your job is, because you've got to take into account all of these potential interactions among the different types of market failure. All right, but undaunted, let's press ahead. What's another issue? What about another conceptual issue? Has to do with transfers. And what is the relation between transfers and social costs that are going to be looked at in a cost-benefit analysis? Well, the traditional view is that transfers between agents are not social costs. So famously, that argument leads to the conclusion that the social cost of crime is the resources that are used to prevent crime, which are deadweight costs, not the value of property that is stolen. Okay, so it might be locks, it might be security guards, it might be altered behavior that you do to avoid crime, but it is not the value of any direct transfer. So it's an interesting question whether we can take this view in the consumer finance context. And I think I'll break it into two pieces. First, are there deadweight costs associated with transfers analogous to crime prevention? And if so, what are they? And secondly, leaving those aside, should we be directly concerned about transfers? So for deadweight costs of transfers, I'm just going to assert without evidence, but put forward a view for you to think about, that we probably don't need to worry much about the direct costs that unsophisticated consumers pay to protect themselves against exploitation. I can't really think of a consumer financial analog of the cost of locks, the cost of security guards, and so forth. However, I do think that the other kinds of indirect costs may be important. This is the equivalent, this is the altered behavior, the equivalent of staying in at night, not going out to enjoy yourself because the streets are dangerous. That is a social cost, and I think we can see evidence that those types of costs exist in consumer finance. So, for example, the work of Guizzo, Sapienza, and Zingales on trust shows that countries and regions where people mistrust the financial system They participate less in the stock market. It can limit the capital that's available for business formation and so forth. I have work using Swedish data which shows that unsophisticated consumers with lower education and income, they seem to not know how to diversify their stock portfolios, but they also tend to avoid financial risk-taking. They're less likely to participate, and they take less risk when they do participate. And in fact, when you think about it, this type of argument is one of the important rationales that's given for the regulation of insider trading. When you think, what is the mission of the SEC? Why do we care about insider trading? The market efficiency view is that insiders are just putting information into prices. This is good. Why should we stop it? One of the counter-arguments is that people need to trust the markets, and if they think the game is rigged, they won't invest. And so that's another type of indirect cost. Finally, I'll mention other types of sort of negative externalities of the system. Chris Carroll has told me two interesting things. One is that the major source of complaints to the CFPB complaint system is debt collection. And the second is that a lot of the complaints have to do with people who don't owe money. And then Chris told me that he himself fell victim to this when he bought a cell phone whose the previous owner of the number was a deadbeat, which is presumably why the number became available. And then Chris started getting all kinds of harassing calls from debt collectors. So Chris, I think you became what fishermen call bycatch. Those are the fish that are caught by accident when you're really trying to catch shrimp, and you end up with a lot of dead fish. I thought of putting a picture of Chris up and then a picture of shrimp bycatch next to him, but I thought that would be too much. Okay, now, so there are, I think, deadweight costs of transfers in consumer finance, but in addition, there may be reasons to be concerned about transfers themselves directly. And I'll just lay out a few of the arguments. So the first point is that, in many of these consumer financial contexts, what we think happens is that transfers are hurting poorer people, and particularly people who are in debt. And these people have high marginal utility and a high marginal propensity to consume. Okay? And the transfers are going to wealthier people who are not in debt, who have lower marginal utility and a lower marginal propensity to consume. Now, that is directly of concern if you have an egalitarian social welfare function and you think, utility is in some sense comparable across agents. So there's all the economists are traditionally very leery of that, but certainly in the political system, this is a line of argument that has some force. But even if you don't do that, if you think ex ante, and you think that markets are incomplete and that there aren't complete insurance markets, we might all agree ex ante that a system that limits these types of transfers away from people in bad states of the world is beneficial because it's a form of insurance. Okay? And then finally, there may be macroeconomic effects which operate through aggregate consumption. In the aftermath of the financial crisis, the government has made some quite strenuous efforts to assist people with high marginal propensities to consume, people like underwater homeowners, and it's been argued that this will help the economy by stimulating consumption. Even if the measures that are used take resources away from richer people, still aggregate consumption will be stimulated, and that'll be good for the economy. So at least in certain circumstances, there might be these macro reasons why you want to care about these transfers. And then beyond that, final point, we may directly value protection of people who can't protect themselves adequately. I think there are degrees of this, and at some point everybody would agree. We protect children, we protect the developmentally disabled, and we protect at least some of the elderly, and we take for granted that a humane society will do that. The question is, where do you draw the line? The counter view is that adults should have responsibility for their own lives, the freedom to make their own mistakes. But I think particularly in cases where it's hard for people to learn from their mistakes over time, such as decisions to use addictive drugs or decisions that you take only once in a lifetime. These may be cases where it's harder to learn from your mistakes, and society feels we should place a direct value of this type of protection and care directly about transfers. Okay, well, that's enough conceptual discussion. Let me finish with one or two measurement issues that are going to arise if we try to really build models that would have quantitative output and deliver us a defensible number. And I'll talk about two measurement issues. The first is how we might estimate the diversity of consumers in a market, and the second is where do we get experiments from. Okay, so this is a chart from a piece that I wrote with Howell and Bridget and Peter that came out in the Harvard Business Review, so they had a great sort of business magazine graphics person who made this picture. What it is a chart with two dimensions. We have on the horizontal axis, we have variation in consumer preferences. You might have some markets where people are very homogeneous, the rational people all want the same thing, and another market where rational people are very heterogeneous. So, things like stored value cards, everybody kind of wants the same thing. Things like hedge funds, maybe people want different things. And then the vertical axis has the level of consumer sophistication from high to low, and the height of the yellow bars is sort of measuring the diversity and sophistication within the market. Sort of stored value cards really only are used by people with low sophistication, but they're homogeneous. Hedge funds really are only able to be marketed to very sophisticated people. But in the middle, you have products like credit cards and residential mortgages where there's a wide spread in the level of sophistication. And of course, this is where much of the work of the CFPB has to go on. Now, why do these two dimensions of diversity matter? Well, when many consumers are unsophisticated, that's going to increase the case for financial protection. So we probably think we should be doing more protection in credit cards than in hedge funds. And when rational consumers have very homogeneous preferences, this lowers the cost of regulation restricting choice. Now, I put in toasters there in the slide. That, of course, I'm referring to Senator Warren's famous analogy of financial products with toasters. And implicitly in that analogy, she is asserting that rational people pretty much want the same thing. We all want the same thing from a toaster. There's really not a lot of diversity there. So to have strict regulation on what a toaster can be is not going to be socially costly. On the other hand, I think when we think about mortgages, there are legitimate reasons for diversity, and so that's going to would increase the cost of a regulation that confines the market to a very, very narrow product range. So in each case, we're going to have to measure these dimensions of diversity, and it's a question of how do we do that. So how do we estimate sophistication? A huge literature on this. Many of you have contributed importantly. I'll just make some very simple points. It's easiest to do in contexts where the behavior we're studying is one of leaving money on the table. So preferences, attitudes towards risk, for example, shouldn't affect the rational benchmark. So some of the stuff that Vincent Yao was talking about this morning with mortgage refinancing, that was a money on the table example. Portfolio diversification, mutual fund fees, these are places where we can leave risk preferences to one side. In such contexts, one thing you can do is to map demographic and economic characteristics that you can measure to optimal versus suboptimal behavior. So a famous example of that is the Agarwal, Driscoll, Gebrex, and Leibson Age of Reason paper, which argues across a variety of contexts that there's a hump shape in sophistication with age. I love the paper and I hate the paper. I love it because I'm at the peak of sophistication, and I hate it because it's downhill from here. I'm on the downhill slope. Now, this kind of work is easier to do in countries that have high-quality administrative data. So, I've done work using Nordic data from Sweden and most recently from Denmark. The second paper there is a paper looking at refinancing of mortgages in Denmark. If we do these studies in the US, I think there's an increasing ability to get data from financial data aggregators like Mint, like Yodlee, and I know the CFPB is thinking about some of this work. But this is worth doing in part because if we can understand the way in which these measurable characteristics map into behavior in one context, we may be able to port the insights over to other contexts and, if you like, construct some sort of index of financial sophistication, even in cases where you can't measure all the mistakes that people are making. And this is related to the concept of qualified consumers or qualified investors that's used to limit access to option trading accounts, hedge funds, and so forth. Now, what about estimating diversity in rational choice? I'll just mention two approaches. One is a little bit more directly empirical, where we observe behavior and we infer preferences. Now, that's only going to work if you have a group of agents who are dominated by people you think are rational, or at least fairly rational, perhaps more experienced, educated, and wealthy. A project I have going on right now with Calvé, Gomez, and Sodini uses Swedish data to try to estimate the three parameters of an Epstein-Zinn utility function for middle-aged Swedish households who've been grouped by education level and employment sector, and we see that more educated people are more patient and have lower risk aversion and a higher EIS. And then there's a lot of variation by cohort and by sector of employment. Now, that, the paper doesn't even exist yet, so I shouldn't put too much weight on those results. But I would argue that, rational decisions that depend on those parameters do vary across households, and any cost-benefit analysis would have to take that into account. The other thing you can do is take a more theoretical approach where instead of observing behavior and then inferring preferences, you could assume preferences and then infer rational behavior using a rational model. This is what in my AFA address I called normative household finance, and it turns out to be very difficult because there's so many complexities in household financial decisions. Taxes, life cycle of income, borrowing constraints, medical expenses, risk aversion, so on and on and on. But one can try to do this. I have this paper with Joao Coco as a model of mortgage default in that spirit, and then this Koyen van Nieuwenburg-Yogo paper is on choices of health and mortality insurance with 2 dimensions of risk. What makes it complicated and interesting is that rational choice, of course, depends on financial and product pricing, which depends on the mix of agents in the market. So why don't people buy annuities? Perhaps it's because they're badly priced. Why are they badly priced? We need to find an equilibrium. Now, I've heard a little bit recently about the CFPB's efforts to put together a heterogeneous agent computation toolkit. I'm not sure the acronym is wisely chosen, but I think the idea is wonderful to try to lower the costs of this kind of work. Having done this a couple of times in different contexts, I know how painful it is, and I think it would be great to lower the entry barriers to this type of work. Now, I know I'm beginning to run over, so let me just finish with 3 more slides. What about experiments? Where are we going to get data on exogenous shocks that we can learn from? I think the theme here is we have to learn from the implementation of existing policies wherever we can, but we have all the standard identification problems of modern applied micro. So the identification police are, guarding the building, and we only get in here once we've cleared identification security. Now, there are lessons from any kind of discontinuity in regulatory treatment, something like the line between jumbo and conforming mortgages, for example. And any lines like that will teach us some lessons, but of course, we all know that these types of discontinuities can distort behavior near them, which makes it harder to learn. I mean, of course, the gold standard in recent research is a combination of a discontinuity with a sudden change in policy that allows us to do a difference in difference analysis. I'll mention one recent example that's come up a couple of times in the last 2 days. Agarwal, Chomsky, Sengfet, Mahoney, and Strobel's QJE paper on the Card Act, where the change in policy is the Card Act, and the the threshold treatment is between personal and small business cards. And that work has given us some nice evidence that this type of regulation of add-on features and sort of hidden fees can alter the costs that consumers pay. Now, I just finished with the thought that the clean natural experiments like this are rare. They're very valuable, they're very rare. They're sort of like supernovas in astronomy. We have to look for them wherever we can and use them. How can we do that? These are all fairly obvious. There's a lot of work on state-level policy variation. But we also need to look internationally because the world is big and there are many other examples in other countries. I've actually been involved in a project to create a website, the URL is up there, which makes it easy to see what work has been done on which countries with which data sets by which authors, and kind of navigate the landscape of international household finance. So if you're interested, that's a resource. And then finally, there are private policy discontinuities of financial service providers, and regulatory agencies like CFPB are in a good position to get data on that. In fact, this afternoon, Stephen Hunt from the FCA is going to report on a study that uses this type of discontinuity in the context of UK payday lending. And then finally, I think we really should consider unnatural, that is to say, deliberate experiments. And I know that this is legally very difficult within the federal government. There's a strong tradition, legal tradition, that says we must have equal treatment of everybody by federal regulation. So conducting experiments is extremely difficult. It does, occasionally happen. The SEC recently had a regulation that was affecting only 1/3 of companies, leaving the other 2/3 out. So that was an example of an unnatural experiment. But wherever possible, we should beat the drum for the value of experiments. Okay, conclusion. I think that cost-benefit analysis for consumer finance is a legitimate goal. It's not a mirage. There is some city there across the desert. But we're a long way away from reaching it, and we can't really, we shouldn't be over-ambitious at this point. I mean, it's premature to be too quantitative and assert that we know more than we really do. But I think we are beginning to cover the ground. When I sort of read the literature and see what's happening, it looks to me as if we're really making progress. I think to continue that progress, the kind of exchange that we see here between academia and consumer regulatory agencies is absolutely essential. And I think research conferences like the one we're at, which I hope will continue in the future, will make an important contribution to that exchange.